Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The last words I ever heard from my father were, "Don't come back until you make something of yourself." That was almost 20 years ago, and until last week, I planned on keeping that promise. I never came back. Not for birthdays. Not for holidays. Not when my stepsister had her first kid. Not when my childhood dog died. Not even when I heard through a distant cousin that my father had a stroke 2 winters ago. And sure as hell not when my stepmother sent me a Christmas card 5 years back with just 3 words written in blue ink. You know why? Yeah, I knew why. I've always known. See, I was never the favorite. Not even close. I was the kid from a mistake they tried to forget but couldn't legally return. My mother died when I was 8, breast cancer. Fast and vicious. By the time I turned 9, there was already a new woman sitting at our kitchen table drinking from my mom's favorite mug. Her name was Karen, and her perfume smelled like fake flowers and fresh judgment. She moved in fast, brought her daughter Lindsay with her, and from day one, it was clear who was welcome and who wasn't. I used to believe that maybe Karen didn't mean to be cold. Maybe it was hard stepping into a family where a ghost still lived in every room. But that illusion didn't last long. Karen never raised her voice, never threw anything at me. No, her version of cruelty was quieter, more calculated. She'd ask if I really needed second helpings at dinner while giving Lindsay dessert. She'd compliment the drawing Lindsay taped to the fridge and ignore mine sitting right next to it. If I got a B+, she'd wonder aloud if the school was lowering their standards. If I got an A, she'd tell me Lindsay got an A+ last year. You know the kind of woman, the ones who smile while slicing you open with a teaspoon. And my dad? Robert? He stood there and let it happen. The man who used to read to me every night before bed suddenly stopped coming into my room after dinner. I told myself he was grieving. I told myself it wasn't about me. But that lie got harder to tell every year. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped trying to get his attention. If he noticed I was quiet, he didn't ask. If I aced a test, he barely looked up. But if Lindsay got a new haircut or won third place in some spelling bee, he'd practically throw her a damn parade. I became background noise in my own house. Not even the black sheep, just invisible. There's one memory that never leaves me. I was 15, sitting at the kitchen table with my acceptance letter to a summer writing camp. I'd won a full scholarship. I was glowing. I was shaking. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the thing that finally made them proud. Karen skimmed the letter and then said, "That's nice. But how will the house stay clean while you're gone?" Robert didn't say a single word. Lindsay came in 10 minutes later with a new cheerleading trophy, and they both acted like Jesus himself had walked through the door. I left home at 19. Didn't even finish college at first. I just packed 2 duffel bags and got in my beat-up Civic and drove until the gas tank screamed empty. I slept in that car for 3 weeks, picking up shifts at gas stations, diners, call centers, whatever kept me moving. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't stay there anymore. Funny thing is, you learn a lot about people when you're nobody. When you're scrubbing toilets or folding someone else's socks, the world assumes you're not listening. But I was. And I soaked it in. Over time, I found my way into community college, then into a startup doing back-end work no one else wanted. I worked nights. Taught myself how to code. Lived on ramen and ambition. Years passed. I got promoted. Then again. And again. Eventually, I launched my own company. Sold it. Launched another. Made my first million before I turned 32. I never told them. Never sent a postcard or a letter. Part of me wondered if they'd even care. Another part hoped they'd find out and feel just a little sick about the way they treated me. But time passed. Silence got comfortable. I built my own life, one they knew nothing about. And that suited me just fine. Until last week. It started with a voicemail I didn't recognize. The voice was older, shaky Robert. I hadn't heard it in over 15 years. He said the bank was coming for the house, that they were in trouble, that they'd exhausted every option. "It's your childhood home," he said, as if that meant something to me now. I didn't call back, but I did book a flight. I told myself I wasn't going for them. I just wanted to see the house one last time before it got sold off to some developer who'd paint over everything and flip it for triple the price. I told myself I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I just wanted to look them in the eye. One time. After all these years. But that wasn't the full truth. The truth was, part of me still wanted something. Not love. Not forgiveness. I stopped needing those a long time ago. What I wanted was to see if they'd recognize me at all. Or if I was still just the girl in the hallway they never looked at twice. The first time Karen told me I was just like my mother, I was 10 years old, barefoot in the kitchen, holding a broken glass I hadn't even dropped. The dog had knocked it off the table chasing its tail, but she looked at me like I'd set fire to the house. She didn't yell, not right away, just squinted with that familiar blend of disgust and boredom before muttering, "You're just like her." Always causing trouble and playing innocent. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, blinking through the heat in my face and the sound of her heels tapping away across the tile. That became a sort of theme in my childhood, Karen assigning blame like it was a full-time job, and me just collecting it like stamps. It didn't matter what it was. If Lindsay was crying, it was probably because I looked at her the wrong way. If the laundry wasn't done right, it was my fault for not reminding Karen the detergent was low. If Robert got upset about bills, Karen would give me that tight-lipped look and sigh, "It's not easy with her, you know. She takes after the wrong one." I didn't know much about my mother back then. Her name was Elizabeth, and from the few stories I managed to squeeze out of my grandmother during holiday phone calls, she had been kind, stubborn, smart, and a little impulsive. She loved to write poetry and baked on Sunday mornings, even though she burned almost everything. She wore red lipstick every day, even to the grocery store, and never let anyone leave the house without a hug. To me, that sounded like a woman worth being like. But to Karen, she might as well have been a curse word. Robert never corrected her. Not once. If anything, he leaned into the bitterness, parroting it back in his own quiet way. He didn't talk about my mom either, not when I asked, not even when I didn't. His silence was heavy, like a punishment he thought I deserved for reminding him of someone he couldn't grieve out loud. Or maybe Karen just didn't allow him to. Sometimes I wonder if he ever visited her grave without telling anyone, if he ever sat in his truck late at night with a drink and her picture and thought about how much easier his life had become by pretending she never existed. Because that's what it felt like inside our house, like my mother had never mattered, and by extension, neither did I. And Lindsay? Lindsay could do no wrong. She was the kind of girl teachers adored and parents praised without thinking. She had Karen's perfect smile and Robert's soft hair and none of my mother's inconvenient shadows. If she slammed her door and screamed, it was just a phase. If I forgot to put my shoes away, it was disrespect. Karen called her sweetie. She called me girl. Lindsay got bedtime stories and piano lessons. I got chore lists and a worn-out toothbrush that nobody replaced for 3 years. There was a birthday, I think I had just turned 16, that burned itself into my brain, so clearly it plays on repeat some nights when I can't sleep. Lindsay had just gotten her driver's permit, and Karen and Robert surprised her with a used Corolla in decent shape. It had a red bow on top and a tank full of gas. She screamed and cried and hugged them like she'd won the lottery. I clapped and smiled, pretending I wasn't bleeding inside. Then Robert turned to me and handed me a folded card. Inside was a $25 gas card and a note in Karen's handwriting that said, "We didn't forget you." I didn't even have a license. I didn't have anything. And somehow, I still felt like I owed them gratitude for the scraps. That's the twisted magic of families like mine. They teach you to thank them for the cold. Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Like no matter what you did, you'd never be enough? Maybe you cleaned until your fingers cracked or studied until your eyes blurred, just hoping someone would notice. If you've ever lived in that kind of silence, drop a comment because I promise, someone else has been there too. Probably more people than you think. Lindsay always had a way of existing that made space for herself, like she knew from the start that the house was hers and I was just visiting. She never said anything cruel, not really. But there was a smugness behind her smiles, like she knew the scoreboard and didn't have to gloat because Karen did it for her. Even the teachers at school treated us differently. Lindsay got asked about her college plans and sports teams. I got asked if I was okay, like I'd wandered into someone else's life by accident. And maybe I had. Maybe that house was never mine to begin with. Maybe my name was just a footnote in someone else's fairy tale. It's funny how people throw the word home around like it's supposed to mean safety or belonging. For me, home was just the place where I learned to disappear without making a sound. I became an expert at taking up less space, hiding emotions, shrinking ambition, folding myself into something more acceptable, more manageable, something Karen could tolerate and Robert could ignore. But all that shrinking, it adds up. Every dig, every eye roll, every backhanded compliment stacks into a wall that eventually becomes too high to see over. And one day, I woke up and realized I wasn't going to climb it. I was going to walk away from it. By the time I left that house, I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was just done. Done waiting to be seen. Done pretending $25 gas cards counted as love. Done carrying the blame for every crack in their perfect little mirror. I took what was left of my dignity and got the hell out, not because I knew who I was, but because I was finally ready to figure it out on my own. And I did. But the scars? They stayed. Quiet, like bruises under the skin. And every time someone says I remind them of my mother, I smile. Because now, I take it as a compliment. When I left home at 19, it wasn't some dramatic movie moment where the protagonist screams at the family and storms out with a suitcase and righteous fire in her eyes. It was quiet, just like everything else I ever did in that house. I waited until Robert and Karen were both at work, left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Thanks for the years. I need new ones," and walked out the front door without locking it behind me. I didn't even cry. I was past crying by then. My tears had dried up somewhere between Lindsay's new car and Karen's last cold smile. I had $612 to my name, 2 duffel bags of clothes, and no idea where I was going. I slept in my car that first night in a gas station parking lot, one of those grimy ones that still smelled like leaded fuel and cheap hot dogs. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't noble. It just was. I worked at a diner from 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, then switched aprons and worked a second shift at a laundromat until midnight. I lived on microwave noodles, coffee, and pure spite. I didn't tell anyone where I'd gone. I didn't have anyone to tell. After 6 months of scraping by, I enrolled in community college. It took me 2 tries to get in. The first time, I missed a deadline because I was working a double and forgot the application fee. The second time, I walked it in myself. I took night classes, one at a time, because that's all I could afford. I studied in break rooms and buses, memorized code in bathroom stalls and back alleys, anywhere the world would leave me alone long enough to learn something new. I fell asleep on textbooks more nights than I care to admit, and there were times I genuinely didn't think I was going to make it. Not because I wasn't smart, but because I was so damn tired all the time. But I kept going, because the idea of ending up like Karen, bitter, petty, full of invisible poison, scared me more than anything else in this world. I didn't want to rot in a kitchen with resentment in my teeth and fake pearls on my neck. I didn't want to become someone who tore others down just to feel taller. I didn't want to look at some teenage girl and see a threat instead of a chance. Eventually, I transferred to a state university, got a small scholarship, and a job in IT that paid just enough to stop living out of my car. The tech world didn't care about pedigree or charm, it only cared if you could solve problems fast. I could. I had a mind for patterns and a soul hungry enough to outwork anyone in the damn room. I started freelancing, then networking, then learning the ropes of startup culture. I built apps that made money. I sold ideas that took off. I joined a tiny team that worked out of a cramped apartment and turned it into a company that got bought out 2 years later. That was the first time I saw 7 figures in my bank account. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in my tiny studio, staring at the screen like it was lying to me. And I laughed. Loud, stupid, teary-eyed laughter that echoed off the peeling paint and cheap blinds. Not because I was happy, not even because I felt successful, but because I thought, if only Karen could see me now. I never told them. Not once. I didn't send a postcard. Didn't drop by for the holidays. I didn't even check Facebook to see how they were doing. I had everything I wanted: peace, freedom, silence, and I wasn't about to give that up by poking the hornet's nest I'd left behind. For all I knew, they thought I'd failed, that I'd ended up waitressing forever or married some deadbeat and moved to nowhere. And honestly, let them think that. Let them live in the lie that made them feel right. Except one day, Lindsay reached out. It came in the form of a short, awkward email. No greeting, no warmth, just, "Hey, I heard you're doing okay. Things are a bit tight right now. Any chance you could spot me for my student loans? Just until I get back on my feet." No mention of the past. No questions about where I'd been for the last 10 years. No apology. Just a digital hand outstretched like nothing had ever happened. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That email told me everything I needed to know. Lindsay still lived in that house, probably still got Karen's approval with every breath she took. Robert was probably still playing the part of silent spectator while his second wife ran the show. And now, when money got tight, I was supposed to be the emergency parachute, the long-lost disappointment turned fairy godmother. No, that door was closed. But it wasn't until a few months later that I got the real kicker. A voicemail on my work phone. I don't even know how they got the number. It was Robert. His voice was gravel now, tired and unsure, like life had finally started collecting its debt from him. He said the bank was coming for the house. They were behind on payments. Karen had some medical bills. Things were falling apart. He didn't ask for anything, not directly. He just said, "It's your childhood home. I thought you'd want to know." I didn't call back. I didn't delete the message either. I let it sit there for weeks, listening to it late at night like it was some strange ghost trying to claw its way into my life. I wasn't mad. I wasn't bitter. I'd done what they always told me to do. I made something of myself. And I didn't know them a damn thing. 15 years is a long time to stay away, but there was something about the silence that had always felt safer than the sound of their voices. I hadn't planned to return, not really, but there's a strange pull that creeps in when you hear the roof over your childhood bed might be getting ripped off and sold to the highest bidder. So I got on a plane, rented a car, and drove the same cracked county roads I swore I'd never see again. I knew the mailbox before I saw the house, dented on one side like someone had backed into it and never cared enough to fix it. The porch was still painted that same tired green, peeling at the edges like a bad memory that refused to die quietly. The house was smaller than I remembered, not physically, just emotionally. It no longer loomed. Nobody knew I was coming. I hadn't called ahead or sent a message because I wanted to see their faces without warning, raw, unfiltered, exactly as they were without the chance to rehearse their reactions. I pulled up the driveway slowly, gravel crunching under the wheels like bones, and stepped out dressed simple. Jeans, boots, dark blouse, nothing flashy. I didn't want to look rich. I wanted to look real. Normal. Approachable enough to walk in the front door, but distant enough that they'd still feel uncomfortable asking too many questions. I didn't even know it was Lindsay's baby shower until I walked through the door and saw pastel balloons and a table covered in cupcakes with blue frosting that looked like it had been squeezed out in a hurry. There were women I didn't recognize, a few cousins I vaguely remembered, and in the middle of it all, Lindsay, pregnant and glowing, surrounded by gifts wrapped in neutral tones and fake smiles. Her face went blank when she saw me, not angry, not welcoming, just blank, like her brain hadn't caught up with her eyes yet. Karen was across the room, pouring sweet tea into mismatched glasses, her fake pearls sitting just a little too tight around her neck. When she looked up and saw me, her mouth stretched into something that could have been a smile, but wasn't. It didn't touch her eyes. It barely touched her face. "Sarah," she said slowly, like she was trying to remember how my name tasted after so many years of not saying it aloud. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" Robert wasn't there. Maybe that was for the best. I wasn't ready to look at the man who used to tuck me in and later forgot I even existed. I nodded politely, said congratulations to Lindsay, and watched Karen fumble through introductions to women who clearly had no idea who I was. One of them asked if I was a friend from college. Karen laughed too quickly, said, "She's family." Technically. That word landed heavy, like a cough she couldn't quite suppress. I took a seat near the back of the living room, just close enough to be seen but far enough to keep my distance. I didn't want to be part of their celebration. I just wanted to observe it, to study the life they'd built without me and see if any cracks had formed in the pretty facade. From what I could tell, they were still as glossy and curated as ever, but there was a tiredness in Karen's posture that hadn't been there before. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes flicked toward the kitchen more than necessary, like she was keeping track of something invisible. Control, maybe. Or the fear of losing it. At one point, I got up to get some water. I wandered into the kitchen where the voices were low and the door was half closed. And that's when I heard it. Karen, standing with one of her old bridge friends. I remembered the woman's pinched voice, but not her name, speaking in that half-hushed, condescending tone women like her had perfected. "I don't know why she came," Karen said, the words sharp and soaked in judgment. "She's always been the disappointment. You know, just like her mother." I stood there for a second, holding a glass that suddenly felt heavier than it should. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just let the words settle in like dust on old furniture. And I realized, after all these years, nothing had changed. I was still the shadow they wished would vanish. Still the ghost they never really believed deserved a seat at their table. It didn't matter what I had built, how far I'd come, or how deeply I'd healed in that house. In Karen's eyes, I was still the girl who'd never quite been enough. I backed out of the kitchen slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of confrontation. I didn't want to yell or cry or break a plate, as much as some part of me wanted to burn the whole damn place to the ground. I went back to the living room, sat down, and smiled at a stranger's baby. I waited another 30 minutes, politely declining food and dodging small talk, until I felt like I'd seen enough. And then I stood up, walked over to Karen, and handed her a small envelope. She looked at it like it might bite her. "What's this?" she asked, and I just shrugged. "Something to remember me by," I said. Then I turned and walked out the door before anyone could stop me. I heard murmurs behind me, Lindsay's voice rising slightly in confusion, the sound of paper tearing. But I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because sometimes the best way to speak is to say nothing at all. Let the silence do the bleeding. Let them read what's written without you having to explain it. Let them choke on the echo of their own words. And God help them when they read what I wrote on the back of that check. I didn't sleep that night, though not because I was angry or even particularly sad, truth be told. It was something far stranger than that. I felt clean. Not happy, not triumphant, but stripped bare in a way I hadn't felt in years, like all the pretense had finally dropped and what was left behind was just the truth, sitting cold and sharp in my chest. I lay in the old guest room, which hadn't changed since I was 16, same frilly curtains, same chipped dresser, same creaking twin bed with the mattress that dipped in the middle like it still remembered my weight. Nothing in that house had moved forward. It was like time had stopped when I left, like they had no interest in remaking the spaces I used to inhabit. Like they'd sealed them up instead, trying to erase me by keeping everything exactly as it was. Down the hall, I could hear Karen laughing in that tight, social way she always did when company was over, even if the smile never quite reached her eyes. Every now and then, Robert would murmur something low and agreeable, that same old dog routine he'd perfected: nod, smile, stay quiet, and hope no one ever noticed that he'd stopped having his own opinions somewhere around the second marriage. I lay there listening to them talk about Lindsay's baby registry, what kind of crib they were thinking of buying, how expensive diapers had gotten. I closed my eyes and let the voices drift into static, tuning them out the way I used to when I was a kid, hiding in closets with a book just to avoid being part of the atmosphere. When morning came, I didn't rush. I took a shower. I combed my hair. I put on fresh clothes again. Nothing fancy. Just clean. Crisp. Like I was preparing for a meeting, not a confrontation. The air in the kitchen smelled like burnt toast and coffee that had been sitting on the burner a bit too long. Karen was flipping through a magazine. Robert was at the table reading a newspaper, as if the past 24 hours had just been some routine little family moment and not a collision of worlds they'd spent over a decade avoiding. Karen didn't look up when I walked in, but Robert gave me a quick glance, that awkward half-smile he always used when he didn't know how to deal with me. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood quietly for a minute, letting the silence stretch a little too long for comfort. Then I placed the envelope on the table. Neither of them moved at first. Robert blinked. Karen flicked her eyes down and then back up at me, her lips curling slightly in confusion. "What's this?" she asked, her voice clipped, controlled, suspicious. "It's not poisoned," I said, sitting down across from them. "Go ahead. Open it." They stared at it like it might explode, and for a second, I thought Karen wasn't going to touch it. But curiosity always wins with people like her. She reached out, peeled back the flap, and pulled out the check. She didn't react at first, not really. Just stared at the numbers, the ink, the cold weight of the thing. Then she read the amount again. And again. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Robert leaned in, squinting at the paper. Then his face changed. The color drained out of him like he'd been punched in the gut with a ghost. He looked up at me, his mouth forming words he didn't say. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the math, the logic, the sudden, sharp realization of what it meant. It wasn't just a check. It was the exact amount of their mortgage balance, down to the last cent you paid, Robert said, voice hoarse like he hadn't used it in years. "I covered it," I said simply. "The whole thing. House is safe. You can breathe again." Karen was still staring at the paper like it had called her a slur. Her jaw tightened. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She just blinked at it, then looked at me with something cold behind her eyes. Shame, maybe? Or fury. Or both. People like Karen don't know how to receive kindness that they haven't earned. It feels like a trick to them. Like someone's playing a game they don't know the rules to, and they hate not being in control. But I wasn't finished. "Make sure," I said slowly, "you read who it's from." Karen flipped the check over. On the back, I had written in clear, precise handwriting, "From the disappointment. The one who made it without you." There was a pause in the room, so deep it made the refrigerator hum sound like thunder. Robert folded the check in half without a word, his hand shaking just enough for me to notice. Karen stood up, abruptly, muttering something about needing to make a call. She left the room like it was on fire, leaving behind nothing but the smell of scorched pride. Robert didn't follow her. He just sat there, staring at the check like it might change its mind and disappear. "Why would you do this?" he asked finally, not angry, just lost. I thought about that for a moment. Not about the money. That part was easy. Money was just numbers. But the act, the gesture, the statement it made, that was the real payload. "I'm not doing it for you," I said. "I'm not doing it for her, either." "Then why?" "Because this house raised me like a weed. And maybe I just wanted to see it bloom one more time before someone bulldozed it down and turned it into a Walgreens." Because no matter how much you both ignored me, this house was mine, too. And because you told me once not to come back until I made something of myself. Robert looked down again, and for the first time since I was a child, I saw something real in his face. Regret. Pain. Maybe even guilt. But I didn't reach for it. I let him sit with it. I stood up, finished my coffee, and left the room. Sometimes the loudest revenge is paid in full silence. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't settle, it sharpens. It hangs in the room like a blade hovering midair, waiting for someone to make the first wrong move. That's what it felt like after I handed them the check and walked away from the kitchen table, after Karen had read what I wrote on the back in a hand too neat to be casual, too clear to be misunderstood. From your disappointment. The one who made it without you. It wasn't a jab. It wasn't a scream. It was a truth so precise it didn't need volume. The kind that sits in your throat long after the words stop echoing. I could hear Karen's heels clicking across the hallway floor before I even made it to the front room. She came around the corner fast, clutching the check like it was a live wire, her face flushed red not with embarrassment, but with that brand of rage that only blooms when people lose control of the narrative they've been spinning for years. She held the paper up in my face like she expected me to deny it, like she thought if she stared hard enough, I'd laugh and say it was all a joke. "What is this supposed to mean?" she asked, voice rising not in confusion but in accusation, like I had somehow sullied the sanctity of her carefully curated world just by putting truth to paper. I didn't answer right away, mostly because I didn't feel like rushing to explain myself to someone who had spent most of her life explaining me away. Karen always needed the upper hand, always needed the last word, the cleanest exit. But not today. It means exactly what it says, I told her, slow and even, watching her eyes flicker like faulty lights. It's not a gift. It's not a plea. It's a fact. She scoffed, the kind of laugh that isn't laughter at all, just pure venom in disguise. "You think this is some kind of triumph," she snapped, waving the check like she was trying to fan the fire she felt rising inside her. "You think throwing money at us makes you the better person? This is manipulation. This is you trying to humiliate us. It's disgusting." I didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Just stared back, calm as stone. "No," I said. "What's disgusting is pretending for 15 years that I was the problem when you were just too small to see past your own bitterness. What's disgusting is watching a man lose his daughter and pretending that silence is love. What's disgusting, Karen, is that you had every chance to build something real with me, and you chose to crush it under your heel, again and again, until there was nothing left but a girl who knew better than to ever expect kindness from the woman who married her father." She went quiet then, not because she was finished, but because she realized I wasn't playing anymore. That whatever game she'd mastered in her own house, gaslight, deny, deflect, wasn't going to work on the woman standing in front of her. Not this time. Behind her, I saw Robert come to the doorway. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. The check was no longer in his hand. Karen had taken it the second I walked out of the kitchen. But his eyes weren't on the money. They were on me. For the first time, really on me. He didn't say anything for a long while, and when he did, it wasn't some grand apology, no carefully composed speech to make up for a lifetime of distance. It was just a quiet, shaky breath and a single word that caught me off guard. "I'm sorry." It wasn't loud. It wasn't proud. But it was real. The kind of real that made something in my chest loosen, not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in nearly 2 decades. Karen turned to him in disbelief, eyes wide like he'd just spoken in tongues. "You're sorry," she hissed, like the very idea of his regret was a betrayal. He didn't answer her. He just stood there, his hand braced against the wall like he needed it to keep standing. His eyes glistened in the way old men cry, not dramatic, not loud, just quiet and slow and full of years they can't get back. Lindsay walked in then, holding a plate of something pastel and frosted, and for a second, I thought she was going to toss it just to break the tension. But she didn't. She looked at me, looked at the check still clenched in Karen's fingers, then back at Robert, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not confusion, not judgment, just weariness. Like she'd always known there was something broken between us and was just too comfortable or too afraid to name it. She didn't say a word. Not to me. Not to them. She just set the plate down on the end table, turned, and walked out the front door like she'd seen enough for one lifetime. Karen stood frozen in place, still gripping the check like she was trying to decide whether to rip it in half or frame it in fury. Robert sat down slowly, rubbing his temples, looking more tired than I had ever seen him. I didn't stay. I picked up my coat, slung my bag over my shoulder, and turned toward the front door, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood like punctuation marks at the end of a chapter no one ever finished reading. As I reached the door, I paused, my hand on the knob. For a moment, I wondered if I'd done it for revenge or for closure, if the money was a scalpel or a gift, a final wound or a kind of mercy. I couldn't tell anymore. Maybe it was both. Maybe that was the whole point. I opened the door, and I didn't look back. I was halfway down the front steps when I heard Robert's voice behind me, cracked and low like he hadn't raised it in years, not even when he should have. "Sarah," he called, not with the force of a command, but the quiet desperation of a man who finally realized he didn't know his own daughter's voice anymore. I stopped, not because I wanted to, but because something in that tone, raw, worn down, frayed at the edges, made it clear he wasn't asking me to stay as a father. He was asking as a man who was scared he might never get the chance again. "Stay for dinner," he said, stepping out onto the porch like the light hurt his eyes. "Just one dinner. Please." It wasn't the word please that caught me. It was the way he said it, like it cost him something. Like maybe it had been stuck in his throat for years, and only now, when everything else was slipping through his fingers, did he finally cough it up. I turned, not fully, just enough for him to see I was still listening. "One dinner," I said. "That's it." And he nodded like that was more than he hoped for. The dining room hadn't changed, either. The same dusty chandelier that always flickered when the heat kicked on, the same scratched oak table with a water ring the shape of Karen's favorite mug burned into the end of it. The chairs groaned under our weight like they resented the people sitting in them. Karen set the table with the good plates, the ones I hadn't seen since before Mom died, and that alone told me she was nervous. She made roast, dry as always, and potatoes swimming in too much butter. Comfort food. The kind people serve when they want to pretend nothing's wrong. Lindsay came back just before we sat down, her coat still on, her eyes unreadable. She didn't hug anyone. Didn't smile. She took her seat without a word, and something about the silence around her made Karen twitch. Robert tried small talk, asking about my work like he hadn't ignored my existence for a decade and a half. I answered in short sentences. Not rude, but not warm either. I wasn't going to pretend for the sake of a casserole. For 20 minutes, we played that exhausting game families like ours know all too well, the dance around the truth, the careful phrasing, the practice smiles, the scripted lines meant to keep the old wounds from bleeding out all over the table. But the tension had already cracked the plaster. It was bleeding whether they wanted to admit it or not. Karen finally broke the pretense. She set her fork down too hard and looked at me with that cold, clipped expression she always wore when she was about to say something designed to sting. "I just don't understand why you had to make a scene," she said, and the room went still, like someone had sucked all the air out through the walls. I looked at her, slow and steady, because if I opened my mouth too fast, I wasn't sure what would come out. "A scene," I repeated. "You think that was a scene?" Robert tried to interject, hands up like a referee who didn't understand the game he was officiating. "Let's just eat, okay? We're all tired." But I couldn't stop now. I'd sat through too many meals swallowing words like glass. Tonight, I wasn't going to bleed in silence. "You didn't break me," I said, the words hard but quiet. "You broke you. You broke this family." And now you want me to fix it for you because I walked out and somehow managed to build something real. But I'm not your apology tour. I'm not the proof that you did something right. I'm the evidence of everything you did wrong. Karen opened her mouth, ready to strike, to dig into her usual well of self-pity and deflection, but before she could say a word, Lindsay, of all people, spoke up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. "She's not wrong," she said. "You made her invisible." Karen froze. Robert blinked like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. I stared at Lindsay, not sure if I wanted to thank her or strangle her for waiting so long to say something. "You knew," Karen said, the words soaked in betrayal, as if Lindsay had just chosen the enemy over her own blood. "I always knew," Lindsay replied, voice flat, eyes fixed on the plate in front of her. "You made her the scapegoat for everything. If I forgot my homework, it was her fault. If you were in a bad mood, it was because of her. I got everything without asking, and she got blamed without doing anything. You trained me to believe that was normal." Karen sat back, stunned in the way only people who've never had to question their righteousness get stunned. "But you never said anything," she whispered. "I didn't have to," Lindsay said. She was already gone. For a moment, no one spoke. Robert wiped his face with a napkin like it could hide the fact that he was crying again, and this time I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt exhausted. Because the truth was out now, messy and undeniable, sitting in the middle of the table between the mashed potatoes and Karen's ego, and none of them had the tools to clean it up. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs screeching against the floor. "I said I'd stay for one dinner," I said, voice steady. "It's over." No one stopped me this time. As I walked out the door for what might have been the last time, I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel satisfied. But I felt seen, and that was enough. I didn't say goodbye when I left that night. Not because I forgot, not because I was in a hurry, but because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been carved out and laid bare between the mashed potatoes and the wreckage of who we used to pretend to be. My footsteps down the hallway didn't falter, and I didn't pause to glance at the pictures on the walls, though I noticed in the corner of my eye that none of them had ever included me, not a single frame. Not a single dusty snapshot of the girl they once tolerated but never claimed. The family had been carefully curated on that wall, a collection of smiles and staged memories where my face had always been conveniently absent. Outside, the night was cold, sharp in the way early spring can be, where winter hasn't entirely released its grip, but the air carries the faintest hint of something new. My breath came out in small white clouds as I stood on the porch for one last second, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind me that I'd survived it all. Not just the night, not just the dinner, but the years of absence, the ache of being unwanted, the years of pretending it didn't still burn somewhere deep inside. Behind me, I imagined the house, as it was in that moment, Robert still seated at the table, the check beside him, mortgage papers folded neatly in a manila folder he hadn't known whether to open or bury. I imagined him staring down at those numbers, seeing the precise balance they'd never been able to manage, and wondering how it had come from the daughter he never quite made room for. Karen, I was sure, hadn't spoken another word since the dinner ended. Her silence wasn't remorse. It was pride cracked at the foundation. She'd built a life around being right, and now the walls were groaning, the roof leaking, and all she had left was the echo of the girl she had dismissed, the one she called disappointment, now written in ink across the check that saved her from losing everything. I walked slowly to my car, the gravel crunching beneath my boots the same way it had the day I first left at 19, a sound that always stayed with me, not haunting, but reminding. This time, I wasn't running. I wasn't broken. I was walking away on my own terms, and that's a kind of power most people never taste. I slid behind the wheel, rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the minute I pulled into that driveway the day before. There wasn't any music. No dramatic crescendo, no slow piano to score the moment. Just the hum of the engine and the steady beat of my own pulse. I looked up at the house one last time, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with something more dangerous, clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from surviving something unspoken for so long that when you finally name it, it loses its hold on you. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't forgiving either. I was simply done. As I turned the ignition, the headlights lit up the edge of the porch where I'd once sat as a child, waiting for someone to notice I hadn't been called for dinner, too afraid to knock and ask. I remembered that version of myself so clearly, small, quiet, hopeful despite it all. I wanted to reach back through time and wrap my arms around her, tell her that one day she'd get out and not just survive but build something no one could take from her. But time doesn't work like that. All I could do now was drive forward. In my head, I heard the words forming already, not spoken out loud, but waiting like a voiceover from a documentary nobody asked to film. Some wounds don't bleed. They just echo. And sometimes, all you can do is make sure they echo back louder, louder than the silence that tried to drown you, louder than the lies they built around your name, louder than the quiet grief of knowing you were never their choice, only their obligation. I didn't drive fast. There was no need. The road was mine now, just like my story was, just like my future would be. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't looking over my shoulder. They could keep the house. They could paint the walls, change the curtains, pretend the ghosts didn't live there anymore. But every time they walked past the kitchen table, every time they looked at the mortgage papers they didn't pay for, they'd remember. They'd remember who saved them. And they'd remember what it cost. Not money, not pride, but something far heavier. Tell her thanks for the house. From the disappointment,